In 1977, Sandy Coughlin, an on-air director for Melbourne's Channel 10 News, would have an absolutely bizarre experience while visiting a beach with her boyfriend. Her experience seems to fit in with so many other accounts in which a sighting of a UFO is followed by a sense that the world around them had changed or stopped. Speaking to Australian paranormal researcher John Pinkney, Sandy claims that she and her boyfriend of the time, a television director, were returning home late one evening from a date. They were engaged in a conversation and decided to get off the road. They pulled into the Elwood Beach car park to continue talking. From what Sandy could recall, the park was uncharacteristically empty, and for this reason, she believes that the incident may have happened sometime in the winter, although she isn't certain. From where they were, they could hear the waves rolling into the shore, and at some point the boyfriend suggested that they go for a romantic late-night walk along the beach. For some reason, Sandy became overcome with a sense of dread. Quote, "For a reason I couldn't understand, I felt terrified, as though there was someone or something out there waiting to get me," unquote. Sandy's boyfriend suggested that she was simply being silly and convinced her to join him. She agreed reluctantly. They got out of the car and made their way down to the water's edge. Suddenly, something very weird happened. The waves stopped. The wind stopped. Everything stopped. Quote, "Everything went deathly quiet. There was not a ripple on the water, as though Port Phillip Bay was actually a big lake," unquote. Not surprisingly, Sandy suddenly felt the urge to get away. Quote, "I shivered and said, 'Let's get back to the car.' But as I spoke, we both turned for no apparent reason and looked into the sky," unquote. Up in the sky, they could see something in the clouds, a bright light. According to Sandy, it looked as though somebody was beaming a searchlight at the clouds. However, the light did not appear to be coming from below. To her, it looked like the searchlight was being beamed from above the cloud. At that moment, a strange feeling of calm came over her. To Sandy, it felt like an invisible wall had been erected around her to keep her safe. She stopped shivering and became relaxed. She and her boyfriend just stood there watching the light, which didn't move or flash. It just shone through the cloud. She gathered that this went on for about 5 minutes, and then the light went out as if somebody had flipped a switch. When that happened, life around her seemed to return to normal. Quote, "At that precise moment, the waves resumed. Not that there were any big waves, just ripples in the bay, but they started rolling in again and the silence was broken," unquote. Sandy remembered that they returned to the car and drove home in silence. Her boyfriend was a skeptic and refused to discuss what happened for many years. However, in 2005, they managed to discuss what happened, and he acknowledged that the event was a, quote, "goosebump experience," unquote. They both agreed that the sighting took place and it was very unnerving, to say the least. One thing that they could not agree on, however, was how long they stayed on the beach watching the object. To Sandy, it was only about 5 minutes. To her boyfriend, he was convinced that it was longer. He was certain that they had watched the object for a quarter of an hour. Sandy further recalled that the morning after the beach incident, she had found a mention of a bright light sighted over the beachside Melbourne suburbs. It was only a few paragraphs well into the newspaper, but it was there. Although the newspaper didn't explicitly say it, Sandy got a sense from the various locations mentioned that the object had been moving along the coast. Quote, "I've always regretted not keeping that newspaper cutting, but my interest was renewed recently when I read that many people report a stillness and a silence during a UFO sighting. This is something I had never realized before," unquote. In another case from Australia, a woman and her son experienced a sense of distorted reality not long after arriving at their beach house. This case was reported to the Australian Close Encounter Resource Network. It was June 25, 2006. A woman and her son had decided to get away to their beach house almost on a whim. When they arrived, it was late in the day, and they decided to go straight to the front and look over the marina to the beach houses on the other side of the inlet. Basically take in the beach at night. They brought along their 17-year-old dog. The animal didn't like the water and tended to stay close. As they peered out over the beach, the mother almost immediately sensed something wasn't right. Quote, "Everything looked distorted, small, and interestingly, we could not hear the seagulls or the noise of the sea. Everything was silent. It was as if viewing the whole surroundings through cellophane paper, or even more bizarre, from another place," unquote. Her son remarked that something seemed strange. Whatever she was feeling, he was feeling it too. Curious, they decided to head down to the main beach, which was situated a 1-mile walk from the back gate, to see if the same weird vibes was apparent down there too. It was. Quote, the sea seemed as if it was boiling and had a phosphorescent color to it. Again, we could not hear the waves crashing on the breakwater rocks or indeed the seagulls. Everything was almost silent. All of the time I was taking pictures with my camera and getting nothing. The air seemed electrified. By this time it was dark, and the time would have been about 7 p.m. Unquote. At this point, her son pointed out the dog was acting strange. The animal, uncharacteristically, was walking out into the water. Quote, my son called to me to look at the dog, which by now was about 10 feet into the water and walking in a straight line out to sea. My son had to go in and pick him up. The dog seemed as if he was on remote control. He was also very cold. This was indeed very odd behavior. Unquote. They decided to take the animal back to the house and get him dried off. As they walked back, the woman continued to take photographs but seemed to be getting nothing. Suddenly she noticed something strange in the sky, a strange reddish haze. She took a photograph of it. Quote, I knew I had something this time because the window in the back of the camera lit up. When back at the beach house, I reviewed the shots taken and was astonished to see the object which appeared on the camera. Unquote. They immediately rushed back to the main beach to see if there was anything there, but whatever had shown up in the photographs had departed the area. Quote, there was nothing unusual, but what was interesting was the fact that everything was cleared and back to normal. We could hear the sea and the birds once more. It was as if viewing the object was a catalyst for normality to return. Unquote. I've given you two examples of distorted realities occurring in conjunction with a UFO sighting. It does seem as though the sensation can manifest in other ways. For a man named Stephen living in Texas, he would experience something very disturbing while walking home from school. It was the first day of a new school. Stephen was about to begin the 5th grade. They had only recently moved to an apartment in Irving, Texas, and he was still quite unfamiliar with the town. His father agreed to drive him in, but it was up to Stephen to walk home. After school ended, Stephen began his walk home. In an effort to familiarize himself with the streets, Stephen looked at each home. He made his way up one street, then around a curve. Quote, after a few minutes I realized I was on the wrong side of the road, that my next street was to the left. I looked both ways and everything looked clear. So I went to step off the curb to cross when I heard a horn. It startled me, so I jumped back just in time for the car to pass. Unquote. Shaking off the near miss, Stephen continued on across the street and up the sidewalk. He had not been on this street before, and he recalled looking at the houses along the way. He remembered thinking that they were pretty nice. He also remembered thinking how cool the trees looked. They were tall cottonwood trees. Quote, I saw a man watering his yard and waved at him. He didn't wave back, but I just brushed it off. Figured he must have just had a bad day. I remember it was hot and the wind felt good on my face. My feet were hurting a bit, not sure why, but they felt really heavy on the concrete as I walked. I got to the end of the road and went to turn left to continue home, unquote. That's when Stephen's walk home would come to a strange halt. The next thing he recalled was waking up on the road. An old man was leaning over him, talking to him. Other people were standing around looking. Stephen asked him what happened, and the man informed him that he had been hit by a car and that an ambulance was on its way. Quote, I remember thinking this guy must be nuts. I wasn't hit by no car. Then I realized there were people all around me. My leg was hurting. I looked down and my knee was bleeding. I went to rub my eye and it was bleeding too. About that time, the ambulance showed up, unquote. Stephen was brought into the ambulance. He talked to the paramedics. Eventually, the police and his parents arrived on the scene. His mother rode with him in the ambulance to the hospital. Quote, she climbed in and the paramedics shut the door and we were off. Mom was asking questions left and right. Me, though, I was tripping to say the least. Not over being hit or bleeding or even Mom freaking out. It was what I saw out the back of the ambulance windows. As we drove on, there were the houses and the trees I had seen walking home. There was the man watering his grass. In fact, there was everything I saw. But how could that be? I had never been down that street before. I was hit a block and a half back, unquote. Stephen found out that the driver had been speeding through the school zone. He came around the curve at 45 miles an hour just as Stephen stepped out onto the road. When he hit the brakes, the car swerved sideways and Stephen was hit by the passenger door and knocked several feet onto the road, where he remained until the ambulance arrived. Stephen had been hit with such impact that the door of the car was dented. Over the years, Stephen questioned what he experienced. He wondered if he was a ghost momentarily. Quote, I wonder if it's the same for them. Were they, in a sense, just knocked out of their bodies prematurely? Does the world feel the same to them as well? These are just a couple of the questions I still want answers to. My only memory still is that car missing me when I jumped back to the curb and walking on towards home. Is that how it is for them? Did their life go on like normal in their eyes? Unquote. Certainly skeptics will assume that Stephen merely hallucinated the walk and the things Stephen believes he cited were merely a coincidence, but it does make you wonder. In Maryland, a woman believes that when she was a little girl, she experienced a different kind of distorted reality, one in which she observed a world not her own through her eyes. A woman named Tracy living in Maryland recalled that back in 1962, when she was 12 years old, her mother had told her to go outside and gather up the twigs and sticks that had fallen from the very large poplar tree in their backyard. She recalled the yard was in full bloom, green and thick grass. She had bent over to gather up some sticks, and when she raised up, the world as she knew it had changed. Quote, I picked up an armload of sticks and bent down to pick up another one, but when I stood back up, I was in another place. It looked rather barren and dry, and I could see hills or maybe mesas in the distance, unquote. As she stared into the distance, Tracy got the bizarre sense or feeling that her people were there in the hills, and it was her job to collect the firewood, which is why she was out alone. She noticed that the wood she was holding was different, as was her dress and her hair. Quote, the wood seemed like driftwood and very dry. I could see my hair blowing in the breeze, and it was very long and wild. I looked down, and I was wearing fur that went over one shoulder and went down to my thighs. I was barefoot, unquote. The experience only lasted a few seconds, and then Tracy was back in her backyard in Maryland. She continued to ponder the events of what she observed for the next 50 years. Quote, I didn't really have any firm explanation of the event until a couple of years ago when I read about time slips, and I now believe that's what happened to me. I have thought about this for the last 50 years, and I believe that I was doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time that I was doing in a parallel universe or dimension, and that somehow triggered the switch. I often wonder what the me from the other place thought when they appeared as me in my backyard in 1962, unquote. A woman named Deborah from Dallas, Texas also claimed to have had a similar type of experience, a glimpse of a world existing in another time and place. Deborah recalled that when she was a little girl, she had been sent to her room by her parents as punishment for something she had done. Deborah remembered that as she sat in her room, everything got really quiet. She assumed that her family had all left, probably gone outside to enjoy the summer weather. She decided to leave her room. She made her way through the living room and stepped outside, expecting to see her family. She did not see them. What she did see still baffles her to this day. Quote, "When I stepped out the door, I was somewhere else. When I looked around, everything was burned and charred, and I could see tall buildings across the way with dead people hanging out the windows. The trees were burned. I mean, everything was gone. I looked down at the ground to see if I could see a bug crawling, and there was nothing. And when I looked down to see, because I couldn't hear a cricket, I couldn't hear anything." Unquote. Even stranger, when Deborah looked at herself, she noticed that she was wearing sandals and a dress. Quote, "When I looked at my feet, I saw that I had on some sandals that I had never seen before, like they kind of laced up my legs, and my dress was tattered at the end, like I had been somewhere dirty, and that scared me." Unquote. When Deborah attempted to go back into the house, she realized that the door was gone. In fact, the whole house was no longer standing behind her. Quote, "I was in another place. The house wasn't even here. It was gone." Unquote. Deborah did not move off the porch. Instead, she merely backed up and reached behind her and felt for the door handle. She felt it. She turned it and stepped backwards back into the house. Inside, her brothers and sisters were sitting in the living room. Quote, "They started screaming, 'Mom, Debbie sneaked out of the window. She sneaked out the window.' But I didn't. I walked right past them, but they weren't there. And now, suddenly, when I go back in the door, my parents went and checked the window, and they couldn't see where I had gone out the window. But I never went out the window. I went straight out the front door. I got a whipping for that." Unquote. Over time, Deborah came to understand what she observed that day. Quote, "I didn't really understand it back then, but really as an adult, when I grew up and everything, I realized I was seeing the results of a nuclear blast." Unquote. Had Deborah stepped out into a future landscape, a possible vision of her own future, one in which our world leaders have taken us to war and nuclear devastation, or was she glimpsing another world, possibly a parallel dimension in which a war was currently underway? Granted, it's also possible that she was merely hallucinating. While it might be possible that one person can hallucinate a distorted reality, is it possible that an entire family could? In 1985, a person living in the UK recalled a very bizarre experience while watching television with his family one Saturday night. The show they were watching suddenly cut to a commercial, and then, in the middle of said commercial, it suddenly cut to something else, something very strange. In the screen of the television sat another family, not unlike theirs, watching them. Apparently the other family could see them as well, and were just as shocked. The witness recalled that the family on the other side of the screen seemed to be pointing at the screen and commenting. Quote, "They were pointing at us, and my dad said excitedly, 'They can see us.' They looked just as surprised as us." Unquote. As the two families sat staring at each other through their televisions, the screen suddenly flipped back to the regular commercial advertisements. The entire event lasted just a few seconds. This account, which comes from the Fortean Times, happened in 1985, years before in-home video calling and things like Skype. Another thing, how is it possible that an old 80s television set, one most likely not equipped with a camera, could broadcast a seemingly live feed to the television of another family, and vice versa in 1985? Quote, "My sister actually remembers it as well and mentioned it fairly recently without me prompting her." Unquote. Is it possible that for a few brief seconds the two families were privy to a type of futuristic technology, or maybe there was a glitch in the matrix? If the witness is to be believed, then we must conclude that our reality, as we know it, isn't what it seems.